start with Ruth. Ruth, give us your 411.
I am Ruth Levy Raymond. There's a couple other names in between, but they're divorced. And I started racing on ice back in Minnesota when I didn't know any better. That's my story.
Fantastic. Ruth, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right. And let's go ahead and work, starting with Bill.
I'm Marty Goldsmith.
Marty, sorry.
And these races that got put on in those years, in the 50s, had a lot of workers. And nobody knew who they were, and they still don't. But I'm one of them. I worked races for the Cal Club as a scrutineer for about 5 or 6 years. And to show that I haven't learned a damn thing in my life, I'm still here working at sports car races for nothing. And, you know.
And you're doing such a good job, we're going to double your salary.
Well, thank you very much.
Excellent.
I'm Pete Van Law. I was a kind of a racer wannabe, and was going to college working for Rex's father, Jack McAfee, after school to earn enough money to keep me in tires, and was racing in the mid-50s, 55 and 56, before Uncle Sam got me.
Perfect. Okay.
I'm Bob Schilling. I saw my first race, a midget race, in 1946, and immediately decided I wanted to be a race driver. And 10 years later, I started racing with a renegade group called Triple R, with a Formula Libre V860, and then went from there to an Austin Healey 100S and a couple of Formula Juniors. And then after a gap when I was basically broke for about 11 years, I was able to drive somebody else's car, a Formula C Italian Techno, and then a Formula Atlantic Brabham. And along the way, I also got into writing about racing. And for the Cal Club publication, the SCCA magazine, and then eventually for hardcover books.
Excellent. Very good.
And they weigh 400 pounds.
It costs a lot of money.
And they cost the same.
30 years in the making.
Okay. Next.
I started sneaking out of the house at night to go see an MGTC that was in a shop window. And this is right after World War II. And my brand new wife woke up and discovered this activity of mine and thought that I had a girlfriend. And I had to drag her out of bed. That was much later, by the way. But I got this, I finally bought an MG from the president of Mexico's son. And I eventually put a Shorrock blower on it. And the first race that the Cal Club or anybody ran was in April of, or something, of the 1950 in Palm Springs, when it was about 115. And I won the novice race. And I was almost ready to to overtake the leaders when my carburetor fell off, right in the pit area, which was very lucky. Ernie McAfee saw what happened, saw the bolt on the ground, raced over, put the thing on, burned his hand, screwed it back on. I took off. I made up the lap. Was just ready to lap the leaders, which was E. Forbes, Robinson, and a guy from Sterling Edwards in a V860 that was smoking and almost on fire. And I was right behind them to take and win the main event, and they got the checkered flag.
All right.
But that didn't stop me. More later.
More later. Absolutely. And down here on the end, you seem a little young to be on this panel. Why are you here?
My name is Rex McAfee. My father was a Porsche dealer in the 50s and a race car driver, so I kind of grew up de facto getting the Stuttgart DNA injected very early. And starting in about 2006, when I finally had a little extra cashola in the pocket, I started vintage racing with a friend of mine, and been doing that since. And got a real rusty 356 in the garage that I swear will get done someday.
Excellent. Very good.
Your dad shocks and
Well, my first question to the six of you, so that everybody can kind of get an idea of what era that you have had either the driver's seat, the position where you've been racing up against other people, or the visual or the coverage as a journalist. What era were you primarily focused on, or did you primarily focus your career, and what drivers were you racing against, or you were witnessing, or you were covering journalistically? We'll start back on the end.
Well, at the time, in those 50s, 55 to 60, the names that would come to mind, they started off as people driving, in many cases, production cars. Try a Dan Gurney.
Okay, there's a good one.
You know, your dad drove all sorts of things. Jack McAfee was just nobody's ordinary driver, I'll tell you that right now. Bob Bondurant, whose name is still in the business. There was a fellow named Kenneth Henry Miles, probably in Europe underrated, not underrated here. He was one of the best Porsche drivers you'd ever want to lay eyes on, and ended up, he really won Le Mans. I don't care what the record book shows, but those were the kinds of names there were, and we saw them 10 weekends a year, up close and personal, and nicest people you'd ever want to meet.
Well, let me ask you something. You were a technical inspector and a scrutineer. Did you ever bust anybody famous?
Oh, we found a few guys that their head studs were a little too long, and we knew somebody had shaved something, things like that. Or they'd come in and a wheel would fall off in your hand virtually. But yeah, sure. But we weren't looking particularly for cheaters. We waited for somebody to challenge.
Excellent.
Unless you saw an outrageous modification. But mostly it was safety. And let me tell you, those cars were none too safe. They were not very good cars.
Well, you were really, really young in the pits with your father, and so I'm sure it was very impressionable to be around some of these very, very famous names. So give me some names of people that you rubbed elbows with that gave you rides in cars way back then.
I kind of grew up as a little kid in the IMSA era, so my first experience, which is way past this whole generation, was in the mid-'70s at Laguna Seca when the paddock was still gravel, and I got to know pretty well Hurley Haywood and George Fulmer, Danny Angias. Those are like my heroes, just because that was my generation.
Excellent. Okay. Hey, Ruth, I'm going to pick on you for a second because I know that you've got some great stories. Give me some famous names and how you know them and who you were racing against back when you were in your heyday. Not to say that you aren't already and still in your heyday, my dear.
What was that?
You're still in your heyday.
For one, I was Jack McAfee's teammate when John Edgar took me on. And I met John and Carol Shelby at Willow Springs, and my reason for being there in the first place was my first race at Bakersfield in California, where I got beat out. I think it was Mary Davis in what I call the biggest roller skate ever made, was a Mercedes 300 SL.
Okay.
Anyhow, so I did well at the race. I got into it about not being able to race with the men, and we took care of that in short order.
Excellent.
So my teammates then became, and the reason I was at Willow was to follow Skip and Dan and learning the corners at Willow. And there was just the three of us out there, and you all know Willow, and if you don't, it's a must.
Oh, and we're going to talk about Willow because we happen to know that there's someone on this panel that might be able to have a little discussion about particular corners.
Who would that be?
I can't imagine.
Let's continue on with the question. Let's go ahead and ask this very dapper gentleman right here. So give me some famous names that you rubbed elbows with.
Well, when I was in the Renegade Triple R,
Okay.
the star, because he had the most powerful car was Bill Krause.
Oh,
Yes.
okay, there's a
And
name.
then when I was started racing the Austin Healey 100S, our class was mixed in with the Corvettes. So I got to watch my rearview mirror looking for Bob Bondurant and Dave McDonald and Dick Goldstrand. And then in Formula Junior, the one who went the farthest among our bunch was Lothar Mutchenbacher.
Okay. Excellent.
Is it a Morgan?
Yay, Susan May. Bill?
I don't know if you've heard of him, but Phil Hill and I Phil became the world's champion, and he and I became very close friends. He was an SC guy. My late wife was from SC, so we got together and at Pebble Beach, which at the second Pebble Beach, I was in the Allard, number 14, and Phil was in it. Excuse me, am I interrupting you?
Yes, you are.
Phil and I had a really good race, and there was one place, and I had a good strategy. I was on the pole. He was right behind me on the inside, and we were playing 1 and 2 for the entire race. There was one place on the course which was called a hairpin, and I would make the Ferrari come down to its first gear, its stump pulling gear. I just kept the Allard, slowed it down, slowed it down, slowed it down, and I could hear the Ferrari behind me, you know, until we got to the corner, and then I would just come around, and then the Allard had a 6-liter Cadillac engine with enough torque to just rip the concrete right out of the ground. And I would just take off, and the Ferrari would disappear until we got all the way around again, and then he was right on my tail. Now that was in the 53 race. Same thing in the 54 race. He had a bigger Ferrari, and I did the same thing to him. And later on, I interviewed Phil, and he says, you know, that was a crooked car.
Would you call that racecraft?
Absolutely.
It was, yeah. I mean, I had 2 speeds forward. He had 5 speeds. So I couldn't fool around. You know, I knew if he ever got around me, I'd never, at Pebble Beach. This was a 2-mile circuit on the 17-mile drive with what they call soft pines on both sides. And I could testify that the only thing soft about them is the first quarter of an inch. Then in the third time we raced, he by now had a 3.5-liter Ferrari, which was really a fast car. And not only that, but it had brake drums that were like garbage can covers. And I'm working, the Allard had MG brakes, because that's all Sidney Allard could get. These little fin things that, were never meant to stop this car. And about 2/3 of the way through the race, I could smell my left front wheel, and it started to grab. And I knew that if I kept doing this, I was in front, and Phil was behind me as usual, and Bill Spear was in a 4.5-liter Ferrari behind him. And, I knew that if I'm going to wreck the car if I don't, I had to make a decision. And I finally did. And I just waved Phil by, and then I held Bill Spear for a full lap, of course. I mean, he's from the East Coast. What else are you going to do?
I used to see Bob Bondurant in my rearview mirror, and especially at Paramount Ranch. He was in his Morgan, and I was in my blue Porsche 1600 Super.
And he had a blonde on his right shoulder, right?
That was during
That was number
lunch.
6.
Yeah, that was number 6.
That
Yeah,
was lunch.
Yeah, right.
Lunch hours was when everybody broke, and that was for the ladies' race.
Okay.
But I was fortunate, and I was on a diet, so I skipped lunch hour.
And she's still on the diet, obviously.
Obviously.
I figured that.
Hey, Pete, last but not least, famous names that you race with, that you rubbed elbows with?
Well, I rubbed elbows with, of course, with Rex's father, Jack, because I worked for him. And, of course, Phil Hill was a hero. I mean, at that time, he was still a young guy, just getting started, but you could see that this was an up-and-coming guy. Bill doesn't know this, but I raced against him. I was on the same track, let me put it that way, at Santa Barbara. You were in an Alpha Giulietta, and I was in my MG, and I think you lapped me twice.
No!
Something like that.
Very good.
But Dan Gurney and Skip Hudson were two other guys. In fact, there was talking about Willow Springs. Rolf Wiederich, I don't know if that name means anything to anybody. German mechanic who'd been with James Dean when he was killed. Rolf was a friend of mine, and I had taken delivery of a 356A coupe. We took it out to Willow Springs, and I was going to, wring it out a bit. And I remember going through the turn 8 and 9 complex, and I'm really manhandling this thing, and on the outside of the turn is Skip Hudson and Dan Gurney in an Alpha Giulietta, and they're laughing and talking, and just, it's like a Sunday drive. that sort of put me down where I belong.
Well, I mentioned that I looked in my rearview mirror for those guys in the Corvettes, because I would calculate before the race that they would lap me twice. And so I was looking for them, and I didn't want to give them any problems. And the one I remember that I think was the best of the Corvette racers, when that was the most popular class, was Dave McDonald. And I would see him, and I'd move over, leave him all the room in the world, and we'd come to the corner, and he would still hesitate for just an instant to make sure I knew he was there. And then he would throw the car sideways in front of me, and I would think, he's lost it, it's all over. And then he'd snap it straight. And I could see him down at the next corner, way ahead of me, and he would do the same thing.
Wow.
And it was always sideways, and then he would catch it. And I thought, he can do that over and over and over again.
And now they call it drifting.
And he never, he always left me room when he lapped me. All those other Corvette drivers, which no matter how much room I left them, would just run me off the road.
There was something that I raced against Jack only once or twice, but the very first Palm Springs race, and Jack McAfee was driving a car for a fellow by the name of Tony Paravano. Tony Paravano, Tony Paravano.
There he is in the back.
No one's seen him, They'd have to dig up one of the freeways to find that. Anyhow, your dad had more balls than I don't know what. He was driving a Cadillac Coupe de Ville, about a 49, 50 something.
48.
And
Better known as the
we
Sherman
had
tank.
the first XK120, which immediately went off the end of the runway when they tried to stop it, and became part of the history of Palm Springs. Choya growing up all around it. But I remember seeing this Coupe de Ville, and I'm thinking, wow, because on about every other corner, just he'd lose it, and I don't blame him. I mean, this thing just was never meant to be driven at speed on a day with that kind of anyhow.
So I'm going to ask you, if you wanted to bring one track back, only one
Paramount
track
Ranch.
back, tell me what that is. Ruth, which one?
Paramount Ranch, off Canaan Road, off the 101, you're down there and there. And
I know it well.
what is it? 3.2,
Oh, no,
Oh,
very
short.
short. Yeah, only
2.29.
just about
2 miles.
2 miles.
50 feet,
Ten
and
miles.
you get a straightaway in 2 corners, okay?
No, you had a little more.
Ruth says Paramount Ranch.
Well, I would say the one I enjoyed most was Paramount Ranch, and but it had its problems. It was hard to pass, I guess, for the drivers. We thought, we watchers said, hey, it's tough.
Hard
But-
yes. It was fun.
But
hard
it's
and
a
fast.
beautiful place.
Very technical.
And just for the rest of the audience here is, if you're interested in seeing the Paramount Ranch, Grand Prix Region is going to run a tour, if you like, a picnic at Paramount Ranch in July.
The grass is growing on turn 1 and 2 and
Yeah.
3, and the bridge is gone. A lot of history is gone.
Oh, yeah,
But that
it's
was
just
a fun
but,
track. It kept you busy. You know, you're never bored. And my favorite race was watching the Corvettes race, you know, because, okay, 2-lane roads were, you know, popular back then, but this was like a lane and a half. And then you watch the vets go out. And Max Balchowski in Old Yeller was a treat to watch. I couldn't believe this guy in this car.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Favorite track that's
Tor-
no longer with us
Torrey
that you'd like to
Pines.
bring back? Torrey Pines?
Yeah, I have great memories of Torrey Pines.
Wow.
It was on
That
the.
sounds more like a golf course.
Well, it is now, yeah. Funny you say that.
Yeah, right.
They said I raced there, and I have no recollection.
Okay. All right. Well,
I
you were
gotta-
fast that weekend, weren't you?
gotta
Favorite track you'd like
nominate-
to bring back?
Well, one of my favorites that's still there is Willow Springs.
Yay.
The one to bring back, I would have to say, I loved Paramount Ranch the one time I ran there, but all things considered, Riverside.
I was just going to say, I want to say Riverside. I was thinking Riverside. Okay. All right, very good. Favorite track you want to bring back?
Pebble Beach, and the reason I say Pebble Beach, it was a beautiful venue. I mean, there's never been anything even close. But I'm going to repeat a brief conversation I had with Carroll Shelby just about 6 months before he died. We were talking about Pebble Beach because Phil Hill, Carroll Shelby, and we cut up 6 races pretty good. And it was the beginning of racing as you and I know it around here. It really kick-started little stuff into, if you go to Monterey and you don't have a reservation now, you'll never get in because there's going to be about 8 million people there and they all have red cars.
Yes.
Maybe one doesn't. But Pebble was really something. And of course, Willow, I have a particular
Well, you
connection
designed it,
with.
didn't you? Weren't you involved in the design?
Oh, I'm going to go there.
Oh, don't go
worry,
there.
I'm going to go
Please
there.
save it.
All right.
Hey, Rex, what would your dad say?
He thought Pebble was a little bit dangerous, and so he would probably say Riverside.
One of you up here wore a very interesting chemical on your driving suit to stop flame from occurring. Can somebody up here tell me what chemical was actually applied to your driving suit before you actually knew what it was?
Baking powder.
Baby powder?
Yeah,
What else?
dip it in baking powder or one of those things for cake making and hang it out on the line and dry. And that was about the extent of it.
What other flame retardant chemicals were put on suits in order to keep it from burning up?
Mosquito spray.
Yep. What else?
Boric
In,
acid.
in
Boric
Minnesota
acid
and
is the one I'm
Elkhart
looking
Lake.
for.
Yeah.
Can you believe it that you would be sweating yourself in boric acid to stop? Yeah, absolutely. How about helmets? Talk about helmets back then.
Leather.
Your early days. Did you have a helmet?
Yeah, eventually.
Was it made out of
We
an
had
old football?
we had
stuffed
we
down?
had Cromwell helmets, which were the
Cromwell,
best
I
looking,
remember those.
and they kill you quicker than anything. But they were good looking.
No,
I must say.
the fashion statement was the Herbert Johnson. I had a Herbert Johnson. When I first got it, I thought, holy.
They were
shit.
nice.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
but they're made out of. It was made out of
Paper mache.
I think it was made out of paper mache.
Out of linen.
Yeah, yeah, linen and linen and lube. Yeah,
You could poke your finger through
pretty
it.
much.
Soaked up the blood.
Somebody
That was
sold
all.
my Cromwell out of the seat of my car, and I said, good.
How about shoes? What they make you wear for shoes? What did you choose to wear for shoes?
You had to have shoes.
I didn't.
You had
I
to
ran
have
out of
shoes.
shoelaces. My dog, I had a white German Shepherd, and for some reason, he nailed all the left shoes. I used to wear high heels, you know, and then he chose to pull out the laces of my one pair of tennis shoes. So I resorted, and this was just about the time Converse was coming out with Velcro straps. I used duct tape, and that was That was the shoe.
Yeah.
I'm an old bicycle rider, and bike shoes were wonderful. They were what car racing shoes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
bicycle shoes were perfect for driving. But I have a story. I still have some red Pirelli golf driving shoes, and I was in Paso Robles, Paso Robles, and I used them just to drive up north when we were going up and back because they were just great to drive in. And my wife and I walked into this cowboy kind of a coffee shop, and then I remembered the red shoes.
Where y'all from?
That's great. And what was the worst wreck? And they walked away. That's the one I want to know
Harry
about.
Schell in Caracas at the Grand Prix in 1957.
Really? Tell me about it.
Denise drove the first 2 hours, and it was my turn around the lap to do my laps. And I came around, I'd been around the track, it was a freeway through Caracas, and I come around, and Harry Schell was standing in the middle of the track. It looks like a tiki torch. And Joe Bonier's car was stuffed in a pole. And they had held the revolution back, and the crowd was just going ape. So here's the crash on the freeway and the smoke, and it was horrendous. And the rioters are behind a chain link fence, and the soldiers with the AKs are shooting over their heads. I want to tell you, that was a race to remember, but that was the worst. That was horrible. I mean, Harry was scorched.
Probably one of the worst wrecks that I saw where somebody walked away. There used to be a rider by the name of Randy McDougall, and he had a Ferrari that he had a custom body put on it because it was a 2-liter Ferrari, and he decided that it was too heavy. So he had this custom body with clamshell fenders and so on. It looked a little like Ken Miles' Mark I Special. I don't know if that kind of goes back, so I don't think anybody relates to that. But he hit the bottom of the turn 5-6 complex at Willow Springs when they still had a berm on the outside of the turn. He hit that thing and he went up in the air on his tail, and he spun around 3 times, landed upside down, rolled over, and then got out of the car. I mean, it was incredible.
I only owe 3 times.
Worst that I saw, he didn't walk away, but he did come back before the end of the racing day. Very first race I went to, midget races in the LA Coliseum, and a driver named Mel Hansen, who had also raced at Indianapolis a number of times. First turn, first lap of the first heat, touched wheels with somebody and promptly snap rolled about 6 times and then did about 4 end over ends and right in front of me. And, with his Cromwell helmet and a bright red cotton shirt and a seat belt that just kept him from falling out of the car, but he was way out of the car flailing around, and they took him away, but by the time the main event came, he came back, and his worst injury was a bloody nose. Wow. And he had a lot of patches of sticking plaster on his face, but he was fine.
I was driving the Baldwin at Pebble Beach, and the year that Ernie McAfee got killed. And Ernie was driving a Ferrari that had already killed somebody else. It was one of the only Ferraris that was a straight 6-cylinder engine, the only one that they ever built like that. And it was everybody knew, it was no secret, everybody knew it was a bad handling car. But I want to back up just about a year earlier. Ernie was one of my mechanics, and when I first started racing this MG, he said, you guys are crazy to do this. And Ernie had had a bad experience in Hollywood on a mountain road where there was a fatality, not him. And this particular road that he crashed at Pebble Beach is the downhill. And about halfway down the downhill, there's an intersection that just came in and left a little bit of a hump in the road. And not in the Baldwin, but in the Allard, I got up to speeds where my car was almost off the ground. I say almost, but it was so light that when we had an offshore breeze, the car would weather vane into the breeze. And I would have to, just before I got to that, I'd have to correct.
Wow.
And it was just past that point that Ernie lost it and went sideways into a tree. And to this day, I'm sure that when he went over that hump, because that car was fast, but it was just unstable. And I think that what happened is he got a little bit sideways, overcorrected one way, and then the other way was too late. And it went off the road sideways.
Tell me about your favorite victory when you really got to sock it to the boys.
I was happy if I could stay with Dan and Skip. If I came in third, fourth, or fifth, I was really happy.
Were they blown away?
No, we were all good friends.
Oh.
You know, they trained me up at Willow Springs, and it wasn't a matter of beating the guys. You know, I was brought up with the guys. My brother used to say, if you're going to play with the guys, no whining. You know, so what am I going to do? You know, it was like when I'm going to drift here a little bit. But when I co-drove with Denise and Sebring, and I don't know, it was 1957, it was toward the end of my career, in an Abarth Fiat, and here's Shelby going by, and here's Sterling going by, I throw a kiss, and I said, Denise, you know, who am I going to pass in an Abarth Fiat Zagato 750? You know? Big deal, you know? So it wasn't important to beat the guys. I just wanted to be accepted, and the first three that really did so were Dan and Skip and Shelby. I mean, we were bubbas. So
That's fantastic.
that's the thing with the guy. And when I started, I'm just going to
Go
drift
ahead.
back a little bit.
Go ahead.
When I started, this was an SCCA party, the first one that I'd ever been to in St. Paul, Minnesota, and 3 martinis later, I had an MG TD ride for the ladies' race on ice on Lake Phelan. And people go, ice? You know, I saw in the Panorama magazine about the Porsche Club, you know, where you go to...
Porsche Sport, yeah.
Yeah.
Driving Sport.
And I cracked up. I get to the first page and I read, they teach you how to drive on ice. We were brought up on it. It's every day. You know, so ice racing, people go, oh, you know, so yeah, well, I go out on my mother's driveway and do a few donuts and, you know, and go to work, you know?
What would be the race that your dad would say would be his the one that he wanted to win the most, that he finally got, that he shared the most amount of joy with you? Tell us the story.
Boy, it's interesting that the one that I think he enjoyed the most was not the one that he won.
Really?
Yeah. In 52, the Carrera Panamericana, he had Ernie McAfee navigating, and they were in a Ferrari 4.1.
Paravano, speaking of Paravano, it was Paravano.
Yeah, it was Tony Caravano's car. And they had gone through the car from tail to nose preparing it. And because he had done the Carrera 2 previous years to that, he had a fairly good recollection of the different segments, and kind of knew that it was a matter of being, you know, pacing yourself. The first the first 4 finishers, you know, of that race after 5 days, 2 of the cars were Mercedes factory cars. Another one was a Ferrari factory, and I can't remember the 4th. But even though he finished in 5th, he knew that it was sort of, you know, that was his, you know, the best anybody with a non-factory car could have done. And so I think that was what he looked back upon the most with satisfaction.
Personal victory.
Yeah, exactly.
The worst race car Tell me about the worst race car.
Oh, God. First race car was a thing that two friends of mine bought.
That already started off bad.
We had,
Was it over 3 martinis?
two of us had been in the service, and we wanted to get back to racing when we got out of the service. And the other one had been a racer. Used to race a singer, if anybody remembers what the hell they are. You know Jack Martin. We keep writing to him. They, coming back from a race in Santa Barbara, there was a Jowett Jupiter Special that was on a trailer in a gas station in Goleta. And they stopped, they looked at it, and they said, this is it. They bought it. It had a Victorous fiberglass body on it. It was the slowest thing in the world. They had a guy go through it. We took it out to Riverside Raceway to try the thing out because nobody had run it before. Well, when we got there, it was an NHRA world or national drag race. So we had to enter the car in Class D sports. Nobody had ever entered a car in Class D sports in the NHRA before. So we each took the car, but we had to go backwards around the track. We'd go down through the drag strip, and then we'd race around the backside of the course and come back, but in reverse. And we would hit, well, the times, you could hear the PA system, the guy would say, 63 miles an hour, that's another record in Class D sport.
Worst race car.
Probably my first one. I saw an ad in the paper, and it was advertised by a guy named Dick O'Neill, who helped Rudy Clay manage the Blarney Castle. And I went there, and it was when Cal Club was just starting to try and introduce Formula Libre to go with the 500cc cars. And so he said, this is a Formula Libre. Well, what it was a V860 midget built in the middle of the 1930s.
I thought you were going to say the middle of the night.
Over 3 martinis.
And it had been fitted with a 3-speed Ford gearbox and enormous hydraulic brakes, but it was a very short wheelbase. I never figured out how to get the wheels off. It had dirt track tires on it, and I ran it with the Triple R because Cal Club wouldn't let me enter it. The president of Triple R was
Yeah, you know
this
who's
guy.
Yeah.
And so I've never forgiven him. But it was really a good car to start with because it couldn't really go fast enough to get me in lots and lots of trouble. But there were all sorts of bizarre things that people had hung on it. It had raced with somebody else at Palm Springs before I got it, so it was a road racer of sorts, but I still enjoyed it. It was a good thing to start with. And then when I came up with some money after I got out of the Army, I was able to get into a more serious car and not be completely at sea.
Bill? You were born in 1925, so if I do the math correctly, I believe that you're the one that is, how should we say, most senior on this panel. So you must have the worst race car and know exactly what it is.
Well, I know what it was. I had to refresh my memory in my book. My publisher, Mark Godfrey's here, in case you don't have a copy. But yeah, there was a junkyard in Burbank, California, and there were 2 brothers named Cannon. In fact, I rest my case. They built a car out of whatever they couldn't figure out what it was, and it was the heaviest, strongest machine that's ever been put together on the planet. In my book, I say I describe this car, and I say you could throw it out of an airplane, and you probably have to put a little air in the tires before you raced it.
Wow.
It had a Jimmy diesel engine.
Really?
Because that was the heaviest thing they could find. I mean, this, you know, and it was ugly, just ugly. And, yeah, I think it was really ugly.
The worst
Could
race
I-
car.
could I just say
Absolutely.
a couple of words about the reason I was laughing about Cannon Brothers? When I was working for Rex's dad, I used to take parts over to the Cannon Brothers to have the machine.
They were like blacksmiths.
They were like that, absolutely. In fact, I had my first MG, I had somebody talk me into getting a Canon cam. That was the big deal. You got to get a Canon cam. Okay, so I got the cam out, took it over to Ted. Now here's a guy who's about 6'4" and always wears a leather apron. And he had a cam grinding machine, and he would literally take a pencil from behind his ear and mark the lobes. That was the profile that you were going to get. And when I got the cam back, I noticed that it was a series of flats all the way around. And so when I got it installed, it was quick, but it had two problems. It sounded like a threshing machine, and it used to go through cam followers in about a week because it would just wear them out. And then, of course, you couldn't adjust the valves from that point on. But that was Ted. He was marvelous character.
You like that car, though, didn't you?
And that shop is still there
It's still
and
there.
still run by somebody from the Cannon family.
Is it really?
Yes.
Still there.
Yes.
Would anybody like to ask any questions? Manny, can I put you on the spot? Our president for the Porsche Club of America, all the way from the East Coast. Actually, the gentleman right there with the hand up. Stand up.
My name's Tim.
What's your car?
S2000.
Dynamite.
What was the biggest advancement that you felt during your time that you were racing?
Repeat it,
Anybody?
please. I don't think
What was that? I
everybody
didn't
heard.
read the
What is? I'm going to rephrase it if you don't mind. What has gotten best over the many years?
The roll bar.
The roll, safety equipment. Safety equipment. I would have to agree with that. Absolutely.
I
How about
never-
tire technology? Tire
we didn't
I would
technology.
say tires because we never worried about safety.
Yeah.
You know, we weren't waiting for somebody to develop a roll bar. We weren't waiting for somebody to make a better helmet. We were racing with what was there because that's what we wanted to do.
Shelby used to say we had no business in any of it. He said, I can't believe we made it this far. And that was about 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I think it was a make of car, and I want to say, and I'm not trying to curry favor, but I had one of the first Porsches out here, and I saw the development of that machine. Even before I owned one, I was in love with it and the concept of putting the engine back on the back. And I love what the old man said. He said, when they asked, why did he put it in the back? He said, well, you can put it anywhere as long as it's light enough. And I've always believed that if you can make, that lightness was a key thing for cars. It still is. And anyhow,
Especially
I had
if they
7
fall
of
on
them.
you.
I love the car. But I think that it represents a tremendous development of engineering all the way.
Fabulous
Following
question.
Chapman's
Thank you very much.
Scott, I came in a bit late, but I want to know if anybody talked about turn 9 at.
Oh,
Cool
that's
Springs.
gonna- that's gonna be-
Because there's people like my friend Dan Hockett over there who happens to like turn 9. But there are so many people that say, God, that turn 9 makes me nuts. And I know that Mr. Pollock here had a lot to do with that track, and he has comments on turn 9. So it's a
Which turn 9?
controversial
Which
turn.
track?
Well,
It's at
Willow Springs.
Willow Springs, big one.
He was a
I'll
developer
be,
of
I'll be
that.
very brief. I was president of the California Sports Car Club, and a guy in bib overalls walked into the office and said, would you guys like to have a place to go racing? And I can't even tell you what I said. But he said, okay, if you want to be at this, and he gave me where it was out in Rosamond, California. Be there tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And so I called a friend of mine, John Hart, who was one of the Lone Rangers.
He wanted a place to tie his horse.
Yeah, and we were there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and Harold Matheson was the man. He was one of 4 guys that owned bike shops and motels and motorcycle shops that owned Willow Springs. And he said, "This is our property." And he pointed out the boundaries. And he said, "And this is my pickup truck, and it's full of stakes. And there's a hammer." And he says, "Go ahead and mark off the course." I got in the truck, and I drove it to the highest point that I could get in this truck, and that's when I pounded the first stake in. And I gave the truck to John, and I started walking, and I walked the whole course and pounded a stake in whenever I felt I needed one. And that was the way we started it. And then Harold borrowed a road grader, and within a couple of weeks he had scraped out and radiused the turns using a couple of 100 or 500 feet of rope. But that's what we didn't have surveying equipment, so the turn 9 started out as a 600 foot or a 900 foot, I forget, whatever. It's a button hook, and the reason is because he ran out of rope.
There you go, guys. You ran out of
It
rope
wasn't
in the
my
50s.
fault.
I run out of room at turn 9.
I had a friend of mine, Fraser McMillan, and those of you who are old enough may remember an oil company called McMillan Ring-Free Oil. And his father was an old Scotchman and tough as nails. And Fraser talked him out of a tanker load of what's called desert mix. And this is kind of a thick, terrible byproduct of distillation that won't work on anything else. You pour it on dirt, you mix it in, and you roll it, and it makes some kind of a surface that is awful. And I invited everybody to come out and drive around it, and I had more hate mail from people who had to then spend months cleaning all the crap off their cars. And then the last part of that is that we finally got a steamroller, or it was, one of those monster things, and I had never driven one. And I said, "I'm gonna drive it," and I drove it, and this thing was topped out at 3 miles an hour. So I didn't know if I was gonna live long enough to get to the top of the hill. So I turned it around, which took about 20 minutes, and then I started down, and I thought, I'm gonna shift it. Big mistake. There's a big lever, and the steering is geared directly to the engine RPM. And it starts out with an engine RPM of about 3. And when I kicked it out of gear, that was the end of my ride, so to speak, because it immediately started to accelerate, and there was no steering left. And now it's rocking like a ship. And so I did the brave thing. I jumped off the back.
Where did it end up?
And it finally. But anyhow, eventually we got the course together. It's now owned by Bill Huth and his family, and they, back when I got out of the service, the Huth muffler was one of the really good sounding mufflers.
Yeah, I had one on my MG.
The Huth
Yeah.
family.
You would.
But now, of course, it's developed now. They've got all kinds of stuff going on
And
there.
everybody
It's
races
busy
it all the
every
time.
day, every
Everybody
day.
races it all the time.
But yeah, so it's a fun place to drive. But the one thing that I asked them to do, I said, the first thing you ought to do is plant trees everywhere.
Yeah, they
And they had a well at the top of the course. And they had water on the course, and they never did. And the last thing is the Randy McDougall story.
Mhm.
My brother was a photographer in the Navy, and Randy was a friend of mine. And he was a screenwriter, and he wrote the screenwriter for Mildred Pierce and got an Academy
I hated
Award.
that movie.
The first thing he did when they brought him out from New York, he says, "What's so tough about getting an Academy Award?" But when he flipped that car, my brother had a photo. He was out there on the course and had a picture of Randy hanging out of the car like this. And so later on, a couple of weeks later, we asked Randy, what was it like spinning over like that? He says, "Piece of cake." He said, "I grabbed the thing. I was down in the cellar, no problem." And my brother said, "Take a look." I don't think he ever got in a car after that.
All right, we have another question right back here, Greg.
What made each of you retire from racing? What was the,
Poverty.
Poverty.
I started out with practically nothing and worked myself up to a state of absolute destitution.
Nothing has changed all these years.
Yes. Yes. Ruth?
What was the question?
What was the reason why you stopped
Driving.
driving?
Medical.
Medical. Okay, that's great. Marty?
I will briefly, for those who hadn't read the obituary, my doctor's report.
It's- you're
Two
not there yet, right?
concussions a year apart. I rolled John Edgar's 4.9 Ferrari at Smyrna Beach, and then a year later, I became really well known at Nassau when I rode Sterling's Aston Martin. Well, it wasn't his, it was the factory.
Mm-hmm.
And they said at the victory banquet, all you had to do was to cross the finish line.
Marty, is anything ever going to make you stop doing this? Because you're still very active.
Marty still drives.
But working at the track?
Yeah. working at the track.
Fatigue and old age, it creeps up on you.
I don't think that'll ever happen to you.
Came it out and still drives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Car people are wonderful people.
Yeah, very good.
Nice to be with.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, real simple, real simple. Yesterday's cars were driver's cars. Today's cars have all the nannies and all the computers and things like that. How do you compare the cars of yesteryear with today's drivers and today's cars with all the nannies?
We don't got no nanny.
I don't want one.
Okay, don't hold back. Bill,
Well,
I know you got an opinion.
I haven't driven one of the new ones, so I can't really describe it. But, you know, we didn't know any better
True.
in the 50s. And we got a lot out of the machines. And it's a little bit like golf or tennis or skiing. I got on some skis a few years ago that I hadn't been on skis for 20 years. And all of a sudden, the skis work. The tennis rackets got bigger. They now work. And I think that the same is true of cars, but I think that there's a certain danger that you can go very fast, maybe too soon with some of these new cars.
Oh, you're not.
That there needs to be some caution with somebody just starting out in a race car, because right now you can walk into a dealer's showroom and buy a 180-mile-an-hour car.
Yes, you can.
You couldn't do it before. We started in MGs, and we worked our way up to faster and faster cars. And now, if you can write the check, you can go as fast as you want to go, and you may not have the skills to do it.
And Bill, that actually leads me to one of my last questions. We're going to try to wrap this up here pretty close. Is there any advice that the panelists that we have up here wish they could give to today's drivers? Because there's many of them before you.
Park your cell phone.
Okay.
I mean, come on. There's no drivers out there anymore. You know, they're all techies, you know, and they're watching their phones and they're watching the readout on their dashboard, and they don't even know their kids are in the back seat tied into, you know, some 5-point hitch or something.
Okay.
You know, sitting backwards. You know, my kids, I could ask my daughter, she's in the audience, how she would feel of being, you know, a child being turned backwards, you know, in a, who regulates that? Whatever, FDA, you know, the narcs, I don't know. Your kid sitting backwards in a car. There's too much crap.
Yeah.
I want simple.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to turn that around and ask you something, Ruth, since you're very passionate about that. What other ways did you learn and become a better driver? Because we have aids. You guys didn't have the same sort of aids. What was your big help?
Would you pass that on to somebody?
Absolutely. No problem.
Yeah, I think when I went to driving school, which was long after I quit racing,
There you go.
I went to Danny McKeever's school out of Willow Springs, and that was a revelation. It was a real revelation, because my introduction to racing, my first race, novice Cal Club race at Santa Barbara, I had my pit next to Jack McAfee, and Jack and Harry Jones, his good friend, were sort of helping me. And their advice was, follow somebody. And that was it. Just follow somebody and
Yeah.
do what they do and stay out of trouble. That was my introduction to racing.
That's it.
Yeah.
Good advice.
Good advice.
All right. Go ahead, jump in there.
Hi, my name is Michael Christen.
What do you drive, Michael?
When I was in high school in the early 60s, I managed to scrape together $550 and I got myself an MGTD with a big dome on the side for the carbs on the 1500 that they stuffed into it. And for those of you who drove wooden MGs, I'm just wondering, how fast did yours go? Because I never got more than about 85 out of mine.
Well, that was way faster than
I had a 1500.
70. My TC with a blower,
Oh, geez,
72,
1100?
73. It was, yeah, whatever they were, it was a 47 TC.
Well, I had some experience with a friend's TD in which he had installed a 169 cubic inch Studebaker Champion engine gearbox and rear end,
wow.
so he could go faster.
I sold the Champion to buy the MG.
And it was really good because it had all that torque. The only thing was that it had the same old MG brakes on it, so you could go very fast. But he was,
In a
the
straight
owner was
line.
riding with me once up near where Paramount Ranch is now, and we came to a curve, and I was still driving it like a race car, and he was going, and I got on the brakes and I realized why he was going that way. And we did make it around, but it was exciting. Yeah. I think a friend of mine who's a better historian than I am, and who spent a couple of years in Europe taking pictures at Formula One races and at the last Mille Miglia, made the comment when a bunch of us were watching a recent Formula One race together. And he said, they've got all these rules and it's boring as hell. And the best time was when there was a rule that the engine had to be under 2.5 liters,
Under the
unblown, 750 cc's blown, and that was all.
Yeah.
And the racing was terrific, and the drivers are memorable.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last chance. This will be the last question. Anybody? Okay. Back there in the back, dynamite.
What is the most current car you have driven around a racetrack?
Nice question.
Repeat the question.
Well, Ruth was in a nice one today on a racetrack. You were in a 997 today. on a
Is that what I
racetrack.
was in?
Was that what I was in? Yes, Ruth, it was a 997.
Well, the car that I was in most recently around a racetrack was this afternoon here, and that was a 2002 Hyundai that was never really meant to do that.
Okay.
I think the best car I've driven on a racetrack, I had the opportunity to drive it twice, 2 years running, was a Audi R8 at Willow Springs. And that's the first time I've driven that track, I don't know how many times. It's the first time I really understood that 7, 8, 9 complex. And partially because of the Audi. I mean, that was a marvelous, marvelous piece of machinery.
Marty might want to talk about his Caymans a little bit too, I have a feeling. Just might want to say something about his mid-engine Caymans there.
Well, it's the one I drive, my daily driver. It's the Cayman S, and it's the,
There's nothing else to say?
it even permits me to drive without killing myself.
And traffic as well.
Bill, the most modern car you've driven on a racetrack?
Oh, come on.
His Allard. It was his Allard.
Stanley Steamer.
Steamroller.
I think 2-liter Maserati. Sebring.
That sounds good.
Excellent. Okay. Well, folks, we would really, really like to give these 6 people right up here a big, big round of applause for coming. My name is Scott Mann. I'm your Chief Driving Instructor for Zone 8. It has been a pleasure. I was
Thank you,
thrown
Scott.
into this not knowing very much about you. I have learned so much. I wish to learn even more. I'm actually going to be buying your book, Bill. I just want you to know that. So I'll go see your publisher. I'll make sure that happens.
I want you to know that
to
I
the
wrote a
rest
book
of you,
too.
I believe the dinner will be served here very, very shortly. So thank you guys very, very much. Enjoy.